Hi, I'm Gary Francione, and this is Dana Charlton, and we are here to talk to you today about animal rights, whatever. And we're talking about, and thank you, Dennis, for inviting us. Where's Dennis? Oh, there he is. Hi, Dennis. Thank you very much for inviting us.
Is it?
Going to a Padre game. So
Oh,
looking for me. And won't be.
say hi to Sweeney for me.
Yeah. And we're going to be talking about the abolitionist approach to animal rights, which is basically 6 principles. And look, I realize that some people here might disagree with this, and that's fine. I mean, I really, I have a view about this stuff and have had a view for a long time about this stuff. And well, not, a lot of people don't agree with me, and that's fine. You do you, you do you, but don't expect me to not do me, because that's just the way, I mean, I feel strongly about it, and I'm sure, if you disagree with me, you feel strongly about your position. In any event, let's talk about the 6 principles of the abolitionist approach. The first one is that all sentient beings, if they're going to matter morally, have to have one moral right. I'm talking about moral rights. I'm not talking about legal rights. Okay, legal rights and moral rights are they're related in certain ways, but they're very, very different entities. And what if sentient beings are going to matter morally, they have to have one right, moral right, the right not to be property. Why is that? Well, let's think about it. Throughout human history, we've had slavery. I mean, a lot of people think, when we talk about slavery, you're talking about race-based slavery. Well, recently we had race-based slavery, but slavery has existed for thousands of years, and it's not been all race-based. As a matter of fact, most of it hasn't been race-based. But what all forms of slavery share is the idea that one human owns another human and has the right to value the interests of the human that is owned, and has the right as property owner to value those interests very, very low, and indeed at zero. Okay. And whatever disagreements we may have about rights, about what rights humans have, I mean, people disagree about rights. We all agree, at least I hope we all agree. We all agree that slavery is bad. We all agree that slavery is sort of outside the realm of permissible. We don't talk about slavery being possibly okay. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. There was a woman at the University of Pennsylvania, which is actually where I started my teaching career. There was a woman at the University of Pennsylvania, and she started having this discussion at the university about whether slavery could be a good situation and morally, an economically sound situation. And she basically was removed from teaching certain courses. I mean, it was regarded as so outrageous. Somebody's got a microphone that is, yeah, okay. That's creating some noise. And we don't dispute whether or not slavery is okay. We all agree it's bad. Why? Why do we think that slavery is bad, where we might have discussions? We could have discussions about whether or not people have a right to health care, or whether they have a right to terminate their pregnancy, or whether they have, other sorts of rights, whether they have a right to use drugs without interference from the government, whatever. We can have disagreements about all that sort of stuff. But we don't talk about slavery. Why is it that we assume that slavery is a problem? And the answer is quite simple. If human beings are going to matter morally, they can't be chattel property, because if they are, then they are owned, and all of their interests can be valued at zero by their owners. That's what ownership is. We have 5 dogs. We love them very much, They are members of our family. But they're our property. So if we got tired of them, or if they were a nuisance, which they are, but I still love them. But I mean, if we decided that this was a really bad idea, we couldn't travel, we couldn't do stuff that, I mean, actually, we don't travel together. So one of us is always with the dogs, always, because we have dogs that have health issues. We have several abused dogs, and we have 3 cruelty cases. And so, these are dogs that, that need attention all the time. And it would be much more convenient if we said, well, let's just get rid of them. As much as I love them, they're my property. And I have one of my rights as property owner is I can value them high. But one of my rights as a property owner is I could value them low. And if I wanted right now, I could put them all in the car and take them to a veterinarian and say, kill them. I could take them to a kill shelter, which would require that I sign over ownership of them. And I would be signing a contract that says, if we can't find a home for these animals, then we can kill them. And you recognize that we have the right to do that. I have to sign that. We live in Pennsylvania. We may be the only Pennsylvanians you'll ever meet that don't own guns, but I could take them in the backyard right now and kill them as long as I did it humanely, whatever that means. But in many places, I don't know what the law is in Ireland, but in many places you can kill animals as long as you do so humanely. You can kill your own animals. So they're my property. They're Anna's property. We can do what we want to with them. We can love them a lot and let them sleep in our bed with them, which we do. Sleep in our bed with us, which we do. Or we could kill them. They're our property. This is something people just don't. And what's really sort of interesting is I'm writing something now about. This is sort of a fundamental problem that Peter Singer has never. I just finished reading the new edition of Animal Liberation Now. Which is as bad in many ways as the other 2 versions of Animal Liberation. And he just doesn't get it. He really just does not understand. He still thinks that that you can talk coherently about the humane treatment of animals. You can't. That's bullshit. Okay, that's the technical legal word for that notion that we can talk meaningfully about humane treatment. It's bullshit. Okay, and the reason why it is bullshit is because animals are property. It costs money to protect their interests. And so if you spend that money, it makes ownership more expensive, right? We could treat animals a whole lot better. I mean, you get rid of factory farming tomorrow. Problem is that it would then increase the cost of producing animal foods dramatically. And the conditions still wouldn't be that great, but they would be better. But it would also cause the price to rise. Okay, and so we recognized a long time ago that human slavery is a bad idea because it basically gives the owner of the slave the right to value the slave, and that right includes the right to value the slave at 0. And so we recognize that if human beings are going to be members of the moral community, then the least protection they have to have is they have to not be property. We could discuss about whether or not they're being discriminated against. We can talk about all sorts of discussions. Is this practice or is this institution resulting in discrimination against people of color or women or whatever? We can talk about that and we can disagree about that, but we don't disagree about the issue of slavery, because we recognize that if humans are slaves, they're outside the moral community, and if they're going to be in the moral community at all, whether they're going to have equal seats with other people, whether they're going to have the same quality of seat, that's a different issue. But if they're going to be in the moral community at all, they can't be slaves. And the same analysis applies to animals. If animals are going to matter morally, they got to have one right. The right not to be property. Okay. The problem is People always say, well, you just focus on this one right. It's a negative right. Okay, fine. It's a negative right. I agree. It's a negative right. However, if you recognize that one negative right, you have to abolish all institutionalized exploitation. None of it can continue because all institutionalized exploitation, the use of animals for clothing, food, entertainment, research, whatever, it all relies on there being property. Okay. And once you say we can't justify treating them as property, then all of those institutions have to go. And it ain't a matter of regulating, it's a matter of abolishing. Have I covered?
I think you're going pretty fast, yes.
Okay. How long do we have, Dennis? I mean, I do these things for hours. I mean, it's just like, I just do them. Dennis, where are you, Dennis? Dennis is left. That's nice, Dennis. That's really nice. He invites me and then he leaves. Dennis, you're breaking my heart here.
Well, we'll talk until someone.
Okay.
Hi,
Well,
Gary, you can talk as long. You can talk. Hi, Gary. Hi, Gary. You can speak as long as you're comfortable with, and we can do Q&A then for a while. And if you have a time limit, let me know what it is. And Andy is doing the the whole.
okay. All right. So basically, just let it go until it.
Hosting.
Okay. Fine. Good. Okay. That may be a bit dangerous of a thing to say to me, but we'll take it.
Why don't you do the run through of the 6 principles,
Yeah.
or else it'll take forever. And
Yeah,
then
I'll do. Okay, I'll
we'll
do the.
questions and answers together. That's
do
the
the-
best thing to do.
All right. I'll do this. She wants me to do the run through of the 6 things, and then we'll do the Q&As together. All right, fine. Okay, here we go. You ready? Okay. All right.
Because we're only on one.
Yeah, we're only on 1. We're going to go to 2. So basically, we have to abolish animal exploitation. Now, the second principle is the rejection of welfarist reform methods and single issue campaigns. Now, this I know is controversial, but let me explain to you my thinking. If we cannot justify using animals, i.e., if recognizing that animals have a moral right not to be property means we cannot justify using them, we've got to abolish animal exploitation. It's not a question of regulating it, it's a question of abolishing it. And the problem is the movement, if you want to call it that, this phenomenon dominated by these corporate charities. The movement focuses on animal welfare reform. Animal welfare reform is morally problematic because if it's wrong to use animals at all, we ought not to be promoting using animals even more humanely. So if it's wrong to use them, we ought not to be promoting using them. That's simple, right? That's the moral issue. And you can say, that's fine, morality, but that's theory, you're a professor, blah, 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 blah. But there's a practical aspect of this. And the practical aspect is animal welfare doesn't work, okay? Animal welfare does not work at all. As a matter of fact, we've had it now for 200 years. This is what just blows my mind. That Singer doesn't see this. I mean, we've had it for 200 years. We're exploiting more animals now than at any point in human history. I mean, it's mind-boggling the number of animals that we are exploiting. It ain't working. Welfare reform doesn't work. As a matter of fact, I think it makes matters worse because it reinforces this idea that there's a right way to do the wrong thing and that we can be compassionate exploiters of animals, and it sort of gives us this sort of this goal to aspire to, that we can aspire to using them in a compassionate way. That too has a characteristic that is similar to the one that I discussed in the last principle of being bullshit. That simply doesn't work. If you look at animal welfare reform, if you look at the level of animal welfare reform, it is basically that level of protection that is required to exploit an animal in an economically efficient way. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. Most industrialized nations that process a lot of animals, they have a law that requires that at least large animals, be stunned before they're shackled, hoisted, and cut, unless it's kashrut or halal, unless it's done under religious, unless it's religious slaughter. You have to stun the animal, and so that the animal's unconscious during the slaughtering process. Now, why is that? Well, if you got a cow hanging upside down by one leg, the first thing that happens is the cow's pelvis breaks, and cow's in a lot of pain. Cow moves around a lot. If that cow is fully conscious, the cow will hit workers. That causes injuries. That's a cost. And the cow will incur carcass damage. Cow will get, there'll be blemishes on the meat. Can't sell it as choice if there's blemish. So there are economic reasons why we require that animals be stunned before they're shackled, hoisted, and cut. It's economically efficient. It's an economically efficient thing to do. Most animal welfare measures are things that make animal exploitation efficient. And that means the level is never good. I mean, these are economic commodities, right? They're things. They have no intrinsic or inherent value. They have only economic, extrinsic, external value. I might love my dogs, but that's because they're my property and I get to determine what they are worth. Okay? Presumably, one of the things when we talk about inherent value of humans, we're saying that I have a value, you have a value. Even if nobody else values you, you value yourself. We don't think that way where animals are concerned because they're just economic commodities. Right now, while I'm talking to you, there are millions of chickens, millions right now, being slaughtered, millions of them. Okay. And by the way, chickens aren't covered under the Humane Slaughter Act in the United States. And why not? Because chickens moving. I mean, it's interesting to me. I actually wrote some essays about this. PETA and HSUS and some of these other welfarist groups have been trying for years to get chickens covered under the Humane Slaughter Act. And what are the arguments that they make? The arguments that they're making is that there are ways of killing chickens which are actually more efficient, which is true. If you were starting a chicken slaughtering operation today, you'd be nuts to use the traditional method. You'd go to control atmospheric killing, which is what these groups like PETA and HSUS are promoting. Is they want to promote this control, gassing the chickens, right? And why? Because, I mean, if you look at the materials that PETA has produced, if you look at the materials HSUS has produced, they all focus on how gassing chickens is economically a better thing to do. And it is, it clearly is. It clearly cuts down on a lot of costs because even though you don't have the same sort of, you still have worker injuries in the chicken slaughterhouse. There's electricity, there's knives, there's, you still have injuries. And there's still a lot of carcass damage because the animals are like freaking out all the time. And there's still a lot of carcass damage. There's still a lot of waste. A lot of meat gets thrown away because of the slaughtering process. It'd be much more efficient to go to controlled atmospheric killing, which is what most of these companies are doing as the tax advantages that they get are dissipating with the current capital investment. They're going to have to make new capital investment. And what they're going to do is they're going to go, I mean, it's already happening. There's already a transition more and more to controlled atmospheric killing because that's the sensible thing to do. And so animal welfare is not about morality, my friends. It is about economics. And that's all it's about is economics. It ain't about morality. We tell ourselves it's about morality. Animal people Peter Singer tells us it's about morality. It's got nothing to do with morality. It has to do with economics. And so if animals have the right not to be property, we shouldn't use them. Animal use should be abolished, not regulated. We ought not to be promoting regulation. If slavery is wrong, we ought to be promoting the abolition of slavery, not beating the slaves more humanely. That's simple. Okay. Anyway, the other part of principle 2, I understand I got 4 more to go after this. I'm really trying hard here. The other part of principle 2 is abolitionists, at least as we have developed that idea, oppose single issue campaigns. Single issue campaigns is basically the business of the movement. It's like anti-fur campaigns, anti-foie gras campaigns, anti live export campaign. All of these things, which are vivisection, these are all single issue campaigns. And the problem is with single issue campaigns convey the idea, they're related to welfare campaigns in that they convey the idea that some things are better than others and worse than others, and therefore some things are more morally acceptable. So think about the anti-fur campaign. I remember when I first got involved in this movement 8 million trillion years ago, and I remember the campaign that was ubiquitous then was the anti-fur campaign, right? The anti-fur campaign. I still remember the first time I remember ever thinking about this issue. I was at the university and I was reading I used to read the New York Times every single morning. And I was reading the New York Times and there was a full page ad about fur. And that was the first thing. And I looked at this and I thought, well, this is really terrible. But then I thought about it a little bit and I thought, well, but in certain ways, you can't really sort of draw a line between fur and wool and leather and all this stuff. And I remember when I was really young going to these anti-fur rallies and people would show up wearing their leather shoes and their wool coats and calling women really vulgar names when they walked by with their fur coats. And I remember thinking there's something really, really messed up about this. Because you got a bunch of people wearing their leather shoes and their wool coats, yelling at women, and sometimes using very vulgar, using really misogynistic, vulgar language, and against women and violent language, and as if the woman wearing the fur coat's any different from the person wearing the leather shoes or if you're wearing there's no difference between wool and leather and fur. And so when you have an anti-fur campaign, which still exists, it's what I find is just remarkable is you think these damn things, if they ever worked, I would say I don't agree with them, but at least they work. But it's like now 40 some odd years later, and the fur industry is as strong as it was. As a matter of fact, it's probably stronger financially. It's not as strong as it has been, but it's certainly stronger probably than it was financially in 1981 or whatever the hell, in 1980, when I opened the newspaper and saw the New York Times thing. And so the ad in the New York Times. And so I think that so it's not that these campaigns work, but they what they do is they're business models. It's part of the business model of the movement. You get people together who are engaging in animal exploitation, and they all stand in and they point to somebody else. They're engaging in animal exploitation. So you get a bunch of people who are wearing their wool and their leather and their silk and their whatever the hell, and they're all standing there saying, "Those sons of bitches wearing fur." And we eat chicken, but let's point our fingers at those goddamn Oriental people who eat chickens or eat dogs and cats and stuff like that. These campaigns are almost always problematic in that they're xenophobic, they're racist, they're sexist. They're really problematic. Because they almost always involve sort of identifying somebody else as the other, and that somebody else is almost always in a vulnerable group, almost always. And so, it suggests, like I remember the foie gras campaign. I had a lot of crap from that because people were saying, "Well, why are you criticizing it?" And I was saying, because there ain't no difference between foie gras and steak or what any other meat. And this idea that you got all these people saying, bad people eating foie gras, people eating beef, pointing the finger, saying people eating foie gras, they're bad people. This is a messed up way of thinking. And because I understand the model, I understand the business model. And when I wrote Rain Without Thunder in 1996, I remember saying I could imagine single issue campaigns that basically identified particular practices, but made it crystal clear that going after this practice was part of going after animal use generally. But I was naive back then because I didn't realize you couldn't have a single issue campaign that was like that because it couldn't work financially. The way these things work is you get people together who are engaged in animal exploitation who will contribute because they think that what they're doing is not as bad as what other people are doing. So they'll contribute money to this campaign. So, I mean, you get people like, these for example, in New York City, where we have carriage horses, right? They have them in other places too, but in New York City, it's a big tourist attraction, right? And so you get people furious about the carriage horses, and they'll contribute money to campaigns to stop, to get the carriage horses off the street, or welfare campaigns to sort of have the horses off the street when it's 92 degrees or above, or some nonsense like that. But they'll go home and they'll eat their steaks. Okay. So principle one, if animals are going to count morally at all, they have to have at least one moral right, the right not to be property. Point number two, that welfare reform campaigns and single issue campaigns are inherently problematic. If anything, they encourage exploitation, because what they do, welfare campaigns make people think that there's a compassionate way to exploit. Single issue campaigns make people think that there are certain forms of exploitation that are worse than other forms of exploitation, and thereby the ones that they're engaging in are better forms of exploitation. So these things perpetuate animal exploitation. The third principle is, okay, fine. What's your practical solution, Francione? What do you think we ought to do? And the answer is, there is one and only one answer. We need a vegan movement. The paradigm ain't never going to shift. Ever, ever, ever. It's never going to shift. As long as we are continuing, as long as most of us are eating them, wearing them, using them in various ways. But veganism is more than just a diet. But diet is the most important part of animal exploitation, because it's what we relate to animals 3 times a day when we shovel them in our mouths. Nothing changes until that changes. Once you get somebody to see that eating them can't be morally justified, everything changes. Until you get them to see that eating them is a problem, nothing changes. So I agree. Veganism is a lot more than a diet, but diet's got to be the primary emphasis, at least in the first instance. We got to get people to stop eating animals, the meat, the dairy, the eggs, the honey, all that stuff. We've got to stop thinking of animals as food. That's where people always say to me, well, what's wrong with eating fake meat? And look, if you're going to eat something, you want to eat fake meat, eat fake meat. I don't eat it, because I don't want to keep reinforcing the idea that animals are things to eat. And what that fake meat does, it's like having I use an example. Facebook is so wonderful, because I can get people so upset by just sort of saying, all I have to do is just like sort of go on Facebook and muse, and I can get people just like sort of apoplectic and angry. So what I said a few weeks ago was, imagine you come into my house and I say, I don't have that human skin lampshade anymore, but I have an imitation human skin lampshade. I bought, I got it from you. You can buy anything on Amazon, and I got an imitation human skin lampshade. Most people would think that's pretty strange, right? I mean, if I said, well, I used to beat, people, but now I don't. Now I have inflatable dolls. They're very lifelike, these plastic dolls, and I beat the shit out of the dolls. You would say, well, it's better that, that you beat the dolls than that you beat a human being. It's better that you've got a fake lampshade than you have a real human skin lampshade. But there's something very odd about you, that you have that, you're still reinforcing this notion that beating people or having lampshades made of skin and stuff, it's just very strange. And so I don't eat, we've got to get people away from this idea of eating animals, that this is somehow normal. And the only way you do that is by taking a really clear, unequivocal vegan position. And that's what I think we ought to do. And, look, you can say, well, but that doesn't go fast enough. And the answer is, I got news for you. Take a look at the situation. I mean, I don't know how Ronnie feels about this, and I actually be curious about it. I think things are worse. In many ways, things are worse than when he and I were young back in the in the first half of the last century. I think in a lot of ways things have gotten worse. I don't know. Roger is Yates here, because Roger's been doing this forever as well. But I don't know how he feels about it. But I think things are really worse. I mean, you can say all you want that vegan advocacy goes slow. I agree, but it sure as hell is a lot better than the complete lack of progress that we've had. I don't think we've made progress. I think what we've done is we've enlightened people about the concept of more about humane treatment, but that doesn't lead to anything. It means that some people who have more money will buy cage-free eggs, and some people who have more money will buy crate-free pork, etc. But
they also don't know if it would ever work because no one's ever tried.
Right.
It.
Yeah, exactly.
There'd be no consistent, serious, well thought out, perhaps even well funded, although we can talk about whether that needs a lot of funding, attempt to spread the idea of veganism being accessible, easy, cheap, and the only moral thing to do in this circumstance. We haven't tried that.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Absolutely. We haven't tried it. And the bottom line is if everybody who's vegan right now, turned one other person on to veganism in the next year, and then that happened year after year after year after year, the world would be vegan in 15 years. So in a sense, you can say, well, it goes really slowly, but is that going to happen? No, it ain't going to happen. Obviously, it's not going to happen. But the potential is there, and we don't spend, Ann and I wrote a book called Advocate for Animals. And the whole point of the book was to say, you can do this. You can go out there and educate people about veganism. And there are creative, nonviolent ways of doing it. You don't have to walk into a restaurant and start yelling at people, or there are all sorts of, there are all sorts of ways of doing this and create. And we all have these opportunities. We all have social circles. We all have people that we relate to, and we ought to be talking to them about this, not in accusatory ways or in condemnatory ways, but but trying to get them to see. Because you know what? Most people do care about animals. A lot of people, I mean, there are people who don't. You leave out, just forget about them. But there are lots of people who do care about animals. And you can get them to see, you can, by using the examples that come up every day where people are doing, like just today, right before I got on this thing, I was looking at my Twitter feed, and there was somebody who took this picture, of some couple, a man and a woman kissing over the carcass of a lion, and saying how disgusting these idiots were, blah 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 blah. And what I did was I went onto Google and I took a picture of two people kissing while there was a turkey there, and I said, there's no difference between kissing your partner over the dead turkey and kissing your partner over a lion. The fact that the lion is endangered, the fact that the lion is majestic, who cares? It's morally irrelevant, and so people do care about animals, and when people like Michael Vick, the American football player, was engaged in dog fighting, or you have that woman fascinating case in Britain where Mary Bale, this woman who lives in Coventry, she's walking down the street and she sees a cat, and for some reason, which I don't think she's ever explained why she did this. Maybe she doesn't know, but Mary Bale took the cat and she threw the cat in a wheelie bin, a trash bin, and cat didn't die. Cat was I was suspected the cat was not happy, but the cat came out a few hours later, and Mary Bale got prosecuted. People the woman had to get protection, police protection. She had to get security protection because people wanted to kill her. Okay. People were angry with her. Why? Because she hurt the cat and she shouldn't have done that. Right. Those are the same people who are going home and eating animals. The same people who are putting leather on their feet. The same people who are wearing, wool or, whatever the hell they're wearing. People don't think. I mean, the world would not be in the shit mess it is in if people thought. So the one thing that we know is that people don't think as clearly as they should. And unfortunately, that's getting worse too, because the internet is in many ways, as an educator, and this is my almost 40th year. This is my 39th year as a university professor. And I have to tell you, the internet hasn't done a hell of a lot for increasing education or critical thinking. If anything, it's gone in the opposite direction. But we're living in a world where people are not critical thinkers, but you can get, I mean, you can get them to focus. And so when I walk into an auditorium of 300 kids and I say, y'all know who Michael Vick is? Yeah, they all know who Michael Vick is. Y'all think he's a bad guy? Yeah, he's a bad guy. Why? Because he killed the dogs. Well, so what? He killed the dogs. Maybe he enjoyed it. Yeah, but that doesn't count. That doesn't justify it. What he did was wrong. Why? Because he did it for no reason. He didn't have a good reason. He just did it because he enjoyed it, and that's not a good enough reason. And then literally, I've got this down to a science. It takes me like 90 seconds, 180 seconds for me to get some student to say that the reason why what Michael Vick did was wrong was because it was unnecessary. And then I say, okay, fine. You a vegan? No. Why not? You got to tell me that. And then I end up having a 3-hour discussion with several hundred kids about why they're not vegan. And you know what? You'd be shocked at how those sorts of discussions, unfold. And you all would also be shocked at the number of kids who come away with that thinking, I got to rethink this. What percentage of them go vegan? I don't know. Some of them do because they get in touch with me. And I'm sure that the others do that don't get in touch with me because, I'm fairly accessible, but, I have no idea. I mean, some people will actually go to the trouble of finding an email address or actually calling my office or something like that. But I'm sure there are other people. I encounter people, who say to me, I was at a lecture you gave, back at Bucknell University 20 years ago. And, boom, I've gone vegan. And so, and I went vegan then. And I've had kids tell me, when I first heard you speak, you really made me angry. You made me, and I said, why did I make you angry? Because I didn't know what to say to you, because you were challenging, you were telling me stuff I didn't want to hear. And then I thought about it and I thought, you're right. And now I'm vegan. So you know what? I can do this. You can do this. We can all do this. And if we want to change the paradigm, we got to do this. It's that simple. It is that simple. Okay. So got to have one right not to be property. Stop all this welfare reform and single issue campaigning stuff. It's useless and it's actually counterproductive. 3, by the way, when I said before vivisection was a single issue campaign, I started off back in the old days when I was actually with PETA. I was actually a volunteer with PETA. Anna and I was their first lawyer, and Anna used to edit the newsletter. That's how far back we go. And that's actually when I met Ronnie. That was about the time I met Ronnie. And I spent the first several years of my life focused on vivisection. I didn't understand the stuff the way I came to understand it. But think about it. Vivisection is terrible, but it's the only use of animals we make where there's a plausible argument that it's necessary to use them. I think that's bullshit. I think the arguments are nonsense, but at least it's a plausible argument. You can't make a plausible argument that we need to eat animal products. You can't make a plausible argument that we need to wear them. You can't make a plausible argument that we need to use them for entertainment. By definition, you can't make a plausible argument that it's necessary to use them for entertainment. And so the bottom line is that that the use of animals in research is the only use of animals we make that is not transparently frivolous. Going after vivisection doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think it's useless. I think vivisection is absolutely useless. But as long as people are eating animals, we've got to get them focused on the eating thing. That's when you're consuming them all day, every day. You're eating them at meals. You're drinking them between meals in your coffee. You gotta get people to see that's a problem. Once, my experience, and it's been ubiquitous, my experience is once you get people to see that eating them is a problem, their whole way of looking at the world changes. You ain't never going to get people. You're never really going to get people to see the problem by doing these single issue campaigns, anti-hunting or this or anti-circus. Vegans don't go to circuses. You try to get somebody, to say, let's boycott the circus. If this person's eating animals and this person has an IQ over 20, eventually this person sort of makes the connection and says, well, well, maybe the circus isn't a good idea, but I do eat animals. Or, hunting's a perfect example. You go after hunting and, people say, oh, it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible that people, go and kill these beautiful animals, the deer and the whatever. And then they take a second, and their IQ of 23 kicks in and they say, you know what? I go to the store and I buy these things. I buy animals. How can I take a principled position against somebody who goes hunting them? And the answer is you can't. It's that simple. And so, we really do have to understand that nothing is going to change until we have a vegan movement. We've never had a vegan movement. There was a vegan movement for a brief period of time in the 1940s in Britain when Donald Watson and some other folks promoted veganism, but that was never a particularly, Donald Watson, I have respect for Donald Watson, but he was not a radical thinker. Leslie Cross was, I think, more of one. But we never really had a sustained, certainly the movement that came into existence in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, that movement's was never focused on veganism the way it ought to have been. And so we need a vegan movement. And it's only going to be a vegan movement that will shift the paradigm. That's principle number 3. I got 3 more, but these are quick. Principle 4 is sentience is the only thing that matters. We listen, this is true of Singer. It was actually true of my old friend, Tom Reagan. And it's true of Jeff McMahon. Basically, all of the ethicists take the position that you need something other than sentience to have a person, to be person. A person is simply a way of describing somebody who's got a morally significant interest in continuing to live, right? Because when we talk about, for example, abortion, and I'm talking to like an Irish audience, so this is the one bond that we have with Ireland. It's like this fetish and fascination and exclusive focus on abortion. But people always talk about abortion and they talk about whether the fetus is a person. Well, they're not asking whether the fetus is human, because obviously, if you get pregnant and you don't terminate the pregnancy, you don't have a giraffe. It's clearly the fetus is human. When people are talking about whether the fetus is a person, what they mean is, does the fetus have a morally significant interest in continuing to live, so that terminating the pregnancy is a violation of the moral right of the fetus to continue to live? That's what that debate is about, obviously, right? And for many people, for many Catholics, for example, I was raised as a Catholic, and I've been recovering from it for decades now. And Catholics believe that that you have a morally significant interest in living if you have a soul, and you have a soul from the moment of conception, which is why I understand the American anti-abortion movement. People look at it and think they're all crazy. No, it makes perfect sense. I understand. I don't agree with it, but I understand how these people think, because I was raised in that tradition. Conception, at conception, there is a soul, and that is an entity that God loves, and blah, 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 blah. And so therefore, there's personhood there. But the problem is you got, like Peter Singer says, you need animals that can suffer. If an animal can suffer, the animal has a morally significant interest in not suffering. But the animal doesn't necessarily have a morally significant interest in continuing to live, because to have a morally significant interest in continuing to live, you have to be self-aware and have a connection with the future self. I think that's wrong. I think Tom was wrong when he talked about subject of a life. A subject of a life was basically a Singerian I mean, it was the same concept Peter had. It was the idea that you have to have you have to have a psychophysical sense of identity. You have to have something which endures over time, a sense of self which endures over time. I think that's all wrong. I think that if you're sentient, you have, you're subjectively aware. You're aware of yourself. You're aware of your own consciousness, and you're connected to your future self, even if it's only the next second of consciousness. In my most recent book, it's a wonderful book too. I have it here so I can sort of, did you notice how smooth that move was? My most recent book. I talk about how you could have somebody who's got severe dementia. Donald Trump, no, I'm okay. But somebody who's got severe dementia, and really can't think very clearly, and can't sort of really, can't project into the future very much, and can't project into the past. We still think that human is a person, i.e., even if the connection to the future self is only 1 second in the future or 1 second in the past, that's enough for personhood where humans are concerned. Doesn't mean that they're the same as normally functioning humans. It just means that they have a connection to a future self or to a past self that is sufficient for personhood. So you could say, well, as between this person who's got severe dementia and can't think more than 1 second into the future or remember more than 1 second into the past, and a normally functioning human, who should we appoint to be a history lecturer at the university? The answer is that's a stupid question. You've got to, if you give that post to a normally functioning person, because the person who's compromised wouldn't be able to do the job. But if the question's a different question, do we use a normal person or this person with severe dementia as a forced organ donor or as an unconsenting subject in a biomedical experiment? The answer is you don't use either of them. And so this idea that, well, in order to be a person, you have to have something other than sentience, I think is just wrong. I think Peter's got it wrong. I think Tom had it wrong. I mean, Tom and I used to discuss this all the time. I never convinced him, but although, well, no, I didn't. I did not convince him. I mean, I think that he, as time went on, I mean, our sort of working closely together sort of faded in the later 90s because we went in different directions. But certainly the idea about the subject of a life and the problems with that concept, I think are insurmountable. I think sentience is the only characteristic that matters. If you're sentient, you are self-aware. When an animal sees another animal running, the animal who sees the animal running knows that it's the other animal that's running and not the person, the being who's perceiving that's running. I mean, any sentient being is subjectively aware and is self-aware. Any sentient being is connected to a future self, if only for 1 second of consciousness. And you know what? Another point I made in my most recent book, it's a very fine book. Another point I made in there is that there's no other way to deal with this that isn't completely arbitrary, because what do you say? I mean, if a sentient being when's the magic time in terms of the future connection? I mean, what if you've got two demented people? One can plan 10 seconds in the one can't plan at all in the future. One can plan 10 seconds in the future. One can plan a minute in the future. One can plan 5 minutes in the future. Are you going to tell me, how do you determine who's the person? Are you going to say, well, one of those is a person, none of them is a person? It's nonsense. It's complete nonsense. And so sentience is the only characteristic that matters. As far as I'm concerned, non-human great apes don't matter more than rats. Elephants don't matter more than rats. I know elephants have different, elephants are cognitively more sophisticated. I understand that. And non-human great apes are cognitively different from rats. I understand that too. But that's not the point. The point is, if they're sentient, they've got everything they need to be a person. Okay. They have a morally significant interest in continuing to live. I think it is the height of nonsense for people to say that a sentient being does not, I mean, it blows my mind that Singer actually thinks that a sentient being does not have an interest in continuing to live. To say that a sentient being does not have an interest in continuing to live by virtue only of being sentient, no other characteristic, is like saying that a being with eyes has no interest in continuing to see. It is nonsense. I don't understand it. I've never heard an explanation from any of these people, that makes any sense. I read what they write. Peter, I remember Singer and I once debated two vivisectors at a medical school. This is going back 25 years. And the debate ended up between me and Peter. I mean, the vivisector sat there. And I argued with Peter about what self-awareness was. And we sat there for 2 hours. I still don't know. I mean, I read everything the guy writes. I've talked with, I still don't know what this means. I mean, same thing with Tom. I mean, I don't understand this whole idea of a subject of the life. It makes no sense to me. Sentience is all that matters. Fifth principle, all forms of discrimination are related. We think that speciesism is bad because it's like racism, sexism, other forms of discrimination, and we need to reject them all. And I get confused when people say to me, well, I'm into animal stuff, but I don't take a position on racism or sexism or something. I don't understand that. I mean, how the hell can you, how can you say, well, speciesism is bad because it's like racism or sexism, but I don't have a position on racism or sexism? I mean, it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. And the sixth principle, and I'm coming to an end now, and that is nonviolence. I see the animal movement as the sort of the peace movement but the peace movement, but including animals in the equation. I really think violence is the problem, and I don't think I don't think violence is a solution to anything. I understand it's controversial. I understand people will disagree with me about that, but the bottom line is, if violence ever solved the problem, we'd be living in the Garden of Eden, because in case you hadn't noticed, the history of humankind, or rather mankind, has been the history of violence. And if violence solved problems, we wouldn't have any more problems, because there's been so much violence. I just don't think violence works. And what this came up in the context of like saying, like that I remember, I'll tell you a story that happened. I was giving a lecture at the University of Guelph in Canada, and there was somebody there. A woman came in, and there were quite a few people there, and she said, she asked me a question. She said, I'm a representative, or whatever she was, she said, for the North American support group of the Animal Liberation Front. And she said, if a vivisector is using 60 dogs for experiments, isn't it morally justifiable to use violence against the vivisector? And I said to her, let me ask you a question. I said, are you vegan? And she said, were you at, who was at the Guelph lecture? Wait a minute, who was at the, I can't see who you are. Oh, you were there. Okay, all right. You were at you were at Guelph. Okay. And so I thought I was really mildly surprised that I wasn't assassinated at that event, and some people were very upset with me, but in any event, and I said to her, is your mom a vegan? And she said, I said, are you a vegan? And she said, yes, I'm a vegan. I said, is your mom a vegan? She said, what's my mom got to do with it? I said, well, just answer the question. And she said, no, she's not, but she doesn't eat beef. I don't know. I mean, well, anyway, she said, she doesn't eat beef, didn't eat beef. And I said, what's she eat? She said, she eats chicken. I said, does she eat chicken more than like once a week? And she said, oh, yes, she eats chicken quite a bit. And I said, well, your mom is responsible for more than 60 chicken deaths a year. Is it okay to kill your mother? And she said, it's different. I said, if you can use violence against a vivisector, why can't you use violence against your mother? And she said, it's different. I said, no, it's not different. I said, I said, just different forms of exploitation. I said, your mother's exploiting animals to vivisect. I mean, violence ain't going to be the problem here. Or isn't going to be the solution here. And so I think, we ought to, somebody I saw I've not learned to multitask, and it's sort of hard for me to read these goddamn things that pop up on the screen, these questions. But somebody just said, we'll get to those. You can ask me about whatever you want to ask me. But those are the 6 principles of the abolitionist approach, and that's it. Now I'm going to drink some tea, and you can ask questions.